So, the 2020 election is right around the corner, and all of New Zealand's political parties are out campaigning, vying to secure your vote. So that begs the question, who should you give it to? Because there's a bunch of political parties, so it can be a bit of a miss trying to find the one that suits you best. That's why in this video, I'm going to be breaking down all of New Zealand's political parties that will be contesting the general election. I'll show you where they stand ideologically, and I'll show you some policies that reflect that. And hopefully by the end of this video, you should have an answer to the question, who should you vote for? But before we dive in and look at the political parties, we first have to understand the political spectrum along which ideology differs. For the purposes of this video, we'll be using a two-axis spectrum. The horizontal axis measures economic policy. On one end of the spectrum, we have the economic left, who believe the government should play a substantial role in our economy to bring out equality among people. This usually means higher taxes, which allows the government to invest more money into meeting the needs of the poor and investing in public services like health and education. At the extreme economic left, all private property is abolished and all resources are communally owned. Then we have the economic right, which believes the government should play less of a role in our economy, as free markets and people work best when left alone. This means lower taxes and less regulation in order to encourage personal responsibility. It also means there's less investment in public services, with the right believing that these roles should be fulfilled by the private sector. At the extreme right, we have total free market capitalism with zero governmental interference. The vertical axis measures social policy. At the bottom of the vertical axis, we have social conservatism, which is based on traditional values and a desire to keep things the way they are. This usually means that they don't support the legalization of things like cannabis, abortion, or euthanasia, but they do support more protection of gun rights, less governmental action in protecting the environment, and less immigration. Meanwhile, at the other end of the social spectrum, we have social progressivism, which believes essentially the complete opposite. They believe that our current laws are mostly outdated and that they should adapt to contemporary society. Perhaps the best way to understand the political spectrum better is to look at where the political parties sit and why they sit there. So let's jump into the political parties, starting with Labour. The Labour Party currently leads our government, with leader Jacinda Ardern currently serving as our Prime Minister. The Labour Party was formed as an amalgamation of socialist parties and trade unions, so it makes sense that they sit centre-left economically. This was reflected in some of the policy they passed this term, which includes increasing the minimum wage, increasing paid maternity leave, fees-free education, and implementing taxes on things such as petrol and roads. More recently, Labour announced that if re-elected, they'll be implementing a new top income tax bracket on the top 2% of earners. The Labour Party leans socially progressive. So in the term just gone, they implemented legislation that restricts gun ownership, that protects the climate through the Zero Carbon Act, and that gives some prisoners the right to vote. They also introduced an act into Parliament to legalise abortion, which the majority of Labour MPs voted for. Then we have the National Party, which serves as the main opposition to the Labour Party. Their leader, Judith Collins, currently serves as the leader of opposition. The National Party is home to a mixture of liberals and conservatives, and they advertise themselves as valuing individual freedom, personal responsibility, and competitive enterprise. They sit centre-right economically, with them opposing most of the new taxes that Labour has introduced and wanting to maintain benefits at current levels. More recently, they announced that if elected into government, they'll be implementing legislation to cut income tax rates. The National Party is socially conservative. They don't want to legalise cannabis, and they have a tough on crime stance that means more crackdown on gang activity and taking away prisoners' right to vote. They did support the Zero Carbon Act, however they did express concern at its methane targets and promised that if elected back into Parliament, they would tweak it. Then we have New Zealand First. They are currently in government in a minority coalition deal with Labour. Their leader, Winston Peters, currently serves as our Deputy Prime Minister. New Zealand First supports nationalist and populist ideologies. In the former, this means limiting immigration and relying less on other countries for our goods and services. In the latter, this means advocating for referendums on things like abortion, euthanasia, cannabis, and other conscience issues. Economically, they're pretty centrist. They support an increase to the minimum wage, however they did block a capital gains tax being implemented in the last term. They are also pretty socially conservative. They voted against legalising abortion and opposed lowering the voting age to 16. They are also known to frequently feature law and order issues on their policy platform. Then we have the Green Party. They are currently in government, but they play a reduced role as they have a confidence in supply agreement with Labour. Essentially, this means they don't have as much say in policy decisions. For example, none of their MPs sit in cabinet. They're led by James Shaw, who is the Minister of Climate Change and Statistics, and Manama Davidson. The party is known mainly for supporting environmentalism, however they also advertise themselves as supporting issues of social justice and honouring the Treaty of Waitangi. They're economically left-wing. They propose introducing a wealth tax and 2 top income tax brackets. This is in order to pay for a guaranteed basic income of $325 per week, as well as increasing other benefits. They're also pretty socially progressive. They support the legalisation of cannabis, euthanasia, and abortion. They support cracking down on gun ownership, and they also want to do a lot more for the environment. They were the main party responsible for the Zero Carbon Act. Then we have the ACT Party, led by David Seymour. They follow the ideology of classical liberalism, which essentially believes that the government should try to stay out of people's lives as much as possible, both in economic and social issues. Economically, this puts them on the right. They support lowering income tax rates and GST, and they also want to cut benefits and freeze the minimum wage. Socially, they're also liberal, which places them pretty much neutral, because they support the legalisation of cannabis and abortion, and David Seymour actually introduced the End of Life Choice Act to Parliament, but they also want to protect gun ownership rights, repeal existing hate speech legislation, and repeal the Zero Carbon Act, instead wanting to tie our emissions to our top 5 trading partners. So those are all the parties that we currently have in Parliament, but there's a bunch more that are right on the cusp of getting in. One such party is the Opportunities Party, or TOP, led by Jeff Simmons. TOP advertises themselves as supporting evidence-based policy. They take policy all over the political spectrum, which can make them kind of hard to place. Their main economic policy is implementing a universal basic income of $13,000 a year. To pay for this, they want to introduce a flat income tax rate on people and companies of 33%. This ends up being pretty much as centrist as our current system. However, coupled that with more taxing on housing and a recently announced tax on junk food, means they're sitting slightly to the left economically. Socially, TOP want most conscience issues to go to a citizens' assembly instead of being decided in Parliament. However, they are strong advocates for legalising cannabis, and they have indicated that they want to reduce the prison population through restorative justice initiatives, so they do lean socially progressive. Hello, it's me, from the future. You might be wondering why TOP is seen as so progressive, even though they don't appear to have that many progressive policies. And that's because I forgot to mention that they have quite extensive environmental policies, which you can see right there. So yeah, back to it. Then we have the Maori Party, led by John Tamahere and Deving Nawarapaka. The Maori Party was in Parliament from 2005 to 2017, however they failed to meet the threshold last election. Maori Party policy is primarily Maori focused. For example, they want to allocate a quarter of COVID recovery funding and housing funding towards Maori interests. They also want to reduce immigration and foreign ownership of residential properties. They sit left economically. They want to increase the minimum wage to the living wage and double all core benefits. Socially, again, the party takes policy from both sides of the spectrum. For example, the party supports giving prisoners the right to vote and doing more to protect our environment, but they don't support legalising euthanasia and abortion. The last party we have on our political spectrum is the New Conservative Party, led by Leighton Baker. The party's ideology is not really a surprise, conservatism. Economically, this places them on the right. They want to cut taxes, freeze the minimum wage, impose more restrictions on receiving benefits, and invest less into public services. Socially, they are again conservative. They don't support legalising abortion, cannabis, or euthanasia. They do support net zero immigration, protecting gun rights, and repealing the Zero Carbon Act. So those are the most popular political parties in New Zealand, but still, there's a bunch more. So we're going to quick fire through those. First up, we've got the Sustainable New Zealand Party, led by Vernon Tava. Now, this party has often been compared to the Greens because its main goal is around environmentalism and conservation. However, they differ from the Greens as they don't subscribe to, for example, progressive social policy or left-wing economic policy. This places them relatively in the centre, where they say they're happy to work with a Labour-led government or a national-led government. Then we have Advance New Zealand, which recently merged with the New Zealand Public Party. They're led by Jamie Lee Ross, who currently sits in Parliament as an independent MP but got in on the national ticket, and Billy Takahika. The main values of the party are freedom and democracy. They support creating a codified constitution and Bill of Rights Act. They support more checks and balances on government power and more transparency and accountability of government power, and they also support the implementation of an independent commission to investigate the potential dangers of things like vaccines, fluoridation in water, 1080 poison, and 5G technology. Then we have the Social Credit Party. They're a centre-left party led by Chris Leach. They subscribe to social credit economic theory, which fundamentally believes that systems were made for men and not men for systems. For example, one of their main economic policies is using the Reserve Bank to borrow money for the COVID relief, rather than private banks. I'm back! So soon. So what I was supposed to say is that social credit's main economic policy is, instead of borrowing money from the private banks, which comes with an interest rate that they'll have to pay back, the government should instead borrow money straight from the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank is a crown entity, and the Reserve Bank can essentially lend the money for a 0% interest rate. So social credit's logic is that if they borrow money from the Reserve Bank, then they'll have less money to pay back, and they'll have more money they can spend in other areas such as poverty, housing, and the environment. Perhaps the best known single issue party in New Zealand is the Aotearoa Legalise Cannabis Party. They're led by Marky Herbert and Michael Appleby, and they fundamentally just stand for legalising cannabis. Then we have the Heartland Party, which is a centre-right party led by Mark Ball. They believe that current policy around protecting the environment is too restrictive on farmers, so they want to repeal or minimalise the impact of this legislation. They do propose alternatives to conserving the environment. There's also the Outdoor Party, led by Alan Simmons and Sue Gray. The party is mainly concerned with environmentalism and conservation, especially for recreational use by New Zealanders. They believe in small government and increased accountability and transparency for use of public power. They also believe there are environmental limits on the growth of the economy, population, tourism and infrastructure, and they oppose the use of 1080 poison and 5G technology. We also have the One Party, led by Edward Shanley and Stephanie Harawira. The party subscribes to Christian fundamentalism. They're economically right-wing, favouring open free markets. They're also socially conservative. They don't support legalising euthanasia and abortion. Then there's the Vision Party, led by Hannah Tamaki, who is the wife of Brian Tamaki, who is the leader of the Destiny Church. Would recommend you Google what the Destiny Church is if you don't know, because it does provide a lot of context to the party. They subscribe to Christian fundamentalism, nationalism, and social conservatism. This was reflected in their social policy, where they're opposed to immigration, homosexuality, and legalising cannabis, euthanasia, and abortion. Both the National Party and the Labour Party have ruled out working with them if they were to get into Parliament next term. And last but not least, we have the Tea Party, led by John Hong and Susanna Kruger. The Tea Party advertise themselves as being culturally diverse, socially democratic, and fiscally conservative. Right, so that is all of the political parties contesting the 2020 general election. As you can see, there's a bunch to choose from, but hopefully this video has kind of helped you understand where each of the parties sit in their values and ideology and policy. My advice would be to figure out what your political ideology is, and then figure out which parties are kind of around that area and look at them more in depth. Alternatively, as I said, they are all out on the campaign trail at the moment, so they'll probably be having events based around where you are. Go to them, figure out if you like their policy, if you like their leader. All of this should give you an answer to the question, who should you vote for? Well, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, Mum. I've never really done anything like this before, so I hope it's okay. If you want me to break down more issues, let me know. Other than that, yeah, vote. Vote. Super quick to enroll, and it's really important, but also put effort into voting. Figure out what the parties are. Other than that, that's about it. So yeah, see ya.